is unusual for these things, pretty much. Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Steffen Turoff. I'm director and principal in charge of planning for Walker Consultants. For about 50 years, we were Walker parking consultants. Given changes in mobility in the landscape, in many ways, we're doing a much broader range of services, really focusing on access and not just parking. But for a long time, our really primary focus was designing parking structures. I came on about 20 years ago, along with a few other people, as we understood that planning was a big part of providing access and parking, and also operations, technology, and increasingly, managing the curb. Uber, Lyft, transit. We're doing more of micromobility, and it's very interesting to see these smaller vehicles. And we have a number of cities, including in Orange County, asking us about those as part of comprehensive access. And that's what we're talking about here. We have done a lot of work with cities, jurisdictions, developers on looking at how much parking is really needed for affordable housing and what the implications are. When I say affordable, I'll say affordable with a small a and sometimes with a large a. What the implications are of providing parking, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But this is increasingly in California, parking and building housing are just hand in glove in terms of getting it done. And we see that with the recent legislation. So there was a lot to talk about here. I was mentioning to Elizabeth, I think what this is really about today is, there's a lot of concern. What about the parking? And we want to talk about, there are some legitimate concerns, but, this is not about the sky falling and everyone immediately being forced into certain behaviors or cars necessarily flooding the street. But this is really, again, speaking with Elizabeth, an honest discussion of what this means and how manageable the situation is. And I think it is. So with that, I would be interested, I don't know, if we have a chat, Elizabeth, I would be interested in understanding, the people on today, are you housing developers, property managers, people in local government, advocacy organizations, just who we have joining us today? Is that something we can have people
Absolutely. Yeah, the chat is open and folks should be able to just put their name and their organization in the chat if they would like to do that. We have a county appraiser.
Fantastic.
Another parking professional.
ABM, awesome. Okay. Thank you. We'll move on. Okay, realty investments. Of all this, I mean, parking touches everything. And again, my photos before showing parking in a mixed use. That little one I just took, I take pictures of parking everywhere. Looking at the implications, compact stalls, large stalls, empty stalls. This one in the middle, that we're adding 2-3 layers of parking under current requirements before AB 2097, maybe even after, as we try to build multifamily. And this one on the right, you see street parking. There is a little street parking there, but people parked in the apron. Just the impacts on the street. And we're going to talk about all of this and how it relates together. Manuel Soto, just a fantastic mobility and professional. Thanks for being here, Manuel. So why are we talking about parking going away? And that's the question we're often getting. And today I'd really like to talk about AB 2097, which effectively eliminates parking requirements within a half mile of what's called high quality transit areas, HQTA. And it sounds pretty like a major deal. And in many ways it is. So SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, has maps out there. They show almost every 5-10 years what a half mile from high quality transit will look like. This is from 2016. I saw they have all the way out to 2045 in Orange County, maybe Northern Orange County. And it covers a pretty big swath of area as to how many areas, locations, will effectively be eliminated from parking requirements. We're going to talk about the coastal zone very briefly. That may be a little bit of a different animal. In the intro to to this presentation. We talked about AB 2011, which now allows multifamily housing to be built on commercial property. I don't think that will have as many parking impacts. I think AB 2097, and then the last bullet, cities just removing parking requirements. Most recently, I think Culver City in LA County just removed parking requirements citywide. What does that mean? What about the parking? Is the parking going away? So next slide, please. So I think just about everyone on here probably recognizes there's a lot of data, and a lot of developers can tell you that it's harder to build multifamily housing. It's hard to get a financial deal done when you're locked into parking requirements, especially if they're very high. Parking is a significant part of the cost. Parking takes up a lot of room. We've dealt a lot with developers and height limits. They'll say, gee, if we provide all the required parking, it's 2-3 levels on what would be, maybe we have 6 stories to work with. That's a real hit. The amount of units that can be provided, the feasibility of sites becomes much trickier when you have a parking requirement and a lot of parking that you have to squeeze on there. Even, typically when we get contacted from a developer, it might be, just a couple of spaces that can make or break things, and yet those couple of spaces are part of the requirement, and it makes it harder to build housing. We've done a lot of research on this. Most recently, I would say with Los Angeles County, researching their parking ordinance and what could be done vis-a-vis the parking ordinance to encourage the production of housing. And from financial data, design specifications, lot sizes, we just saw that parking requirements are indeed a real hit on developers as they try to build housing. And that's not necessarily such a new idea or new finding, but to really look at specific areas of LA County and seeing how that applied there. This was unincorporated LA County. It was very instructive, and it is a big deal. So, a little graphic we have on the right that we were trying to use to convey what we're looking at here is how much land and how much capital infrastructure goes to parking. And as, parking requirements are reduced, what that might look like. With a little less land, a little less of the, built area of the FAR devoted to parking. And can we whittle away of some of that need for parking with, as you'll see on the bottom right, some pedestrians, some transit access. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So this is the same thing. Again, parking requirements, why reduce them? Because they really do make it harder to build housing. And as we're all scrambling to get more housing built in Southern California, per the housing elements, RENA requirements, you see here again, this was, again, I drive down the street, I see these and I think, wow, 5 stories, 2 of those are parking. It's a lot of, essentially very often it is a zero-sum game. Do we spend the resources and the space on parking or on housing units? And requirements mandate that those resources go to parking. And I think that's what AB 2097 really is trying to address. So next slide, please. So keep in mind, this is about the jargon, the vocabulary here. It is also about how we think about these things. A minimum parking requirement does not necessarily equal the parking supplied. Just because developers don't have a requirement to build parking doesn't mean they don't do so. Typically, they do so. They need to. At the same time, it doesn't equal parking demand. So yes, sometimes with a lower parking requirement, we may see some spillover, as in the photo on the right, but sometimes you have a parking requirement and spaces sit empty, like you see on the left. So all 3 of these things, we get calls from cities, from builders, how much parking, do I need? And we say, are you talking about a requirement? Are you talking about the demand? Are you talking about, what your lender's saying, the market? It's squishy how much you need. Next slide, please. So today's discussion is really about what we can expect moving forward. How can we build and live without parking? We're not really talking about that. We're probably talking about less parking, but not without parking by any means. What will happen? And again, as I spoke with Elizabeth, and I said, well, who's going to be on this? This is really there's sort of a good and the bad. There's not the ugly, but a good and the bad of this. The sky is not falling, but things are going to change a little bit. What today's discussion is not about legal interpretation of these bills, just what are they allowing? That's a tricky one. I personally think that there's going to be a lot of challenges, both on the local government and neighborhood group side and on cities, as some developers try to take advantage of, or just, when I say take advantage of, just use AB 2097. What does it mean for overlay zones, specific plans, CUPs, in lieu fees, retroactively? Can you retroactively eliminate a parking requirement? What happens in the coastal zone? What we're seeing right now, and we work in several different coastal zone areas, is coastal can still require parking. I don't know if that's been determined yet or not, but I think this is going to be much harder to implement the removal of parking requirements in the coastal zone, as coastal is trying to guarantee access to the public for coastal areas. And as you build more housing in those areas, parking's impacted. The public's access to the coast is impacted. I think that's the argument you're going to see there. And I think the coastal zone is going to be a different animal. Things like the density bonus, we've had that conversation, density bonus versus park, how is the density bonus still effective with the elimination of parking requirements? This is your area. I'm not an expert on density bonus. I don't think we want to talk so much about that. I have heard basically that this is a good thing, whether or not density bonus comes into play. But really, this is, what are we to expect to seeing? And when you deal with, community groups or developers or cities, what do you think is going to happen with all this? Let's talk about that. Next slide. So parking spaces, they're not going away for the most part. We've had a number of people contact us and we tell them, AB 2097, we don't think you're required to build any parking. And first thing we hear is, we want to rent out these units. Sometimes we want to sell these units, which is even typically a need for in the market for more parking. Renters and buyers still want them. So we're going to build them. And we're going to build as many spaces we think are necessary to sell these units. And in most cases, we are far too nervous at the marketability of these units about them if we don't build a robust number of parking spaces. Lenders and investors often force the issue with developers. They want to see them, and they get very skittish about lending and investing in a project if there's not plenty of parking. When are parking spaces going away or reduced? When we see parking maximums. So minimum parking requirements are a floor, and in a lot of places now they're going away. But nobody's saying you can't build parking. Nobody's prohibiting it, and very few exceptions in California, maybe in the San Francisco's, occasionally in the Berkeley's, I think, would you see a ceiling. But nobody's saying don't build parking. They're just saying you're not required to build all this parking. The table down here, this is from the Urban Land Institute, International Council of Shopping Centers, and National Parking Association shared parking model, which our firm, Walker, led the development of. It's now in the 3rd edition. It has projected ratios for everything, including multifamily residential. Now, these are tricky because this is about an 85th percentile, meaning it's the higher end of what we see, but but a parking requirement is so rigid. We know there are variations on this. Nonetheless, we think that this is a good starting point for free residential parking in an automobile-dependent location. A studio, 1 space, per unit. 1 bedroom isn't that much different. 2 bedrooms, 1.8. 3 bedrooms, 2.65. And again, we make adjustments based on transit accessibility, job accessibility, potentially affordability of the units. But this is a really good starting point to figure out just what demand in a lot of places, I think, will be. And here's what we often hear in public meetings. I know that family that has 3 cars or 4 cars, and it may be a affordability issue, multi-generational issue, kids who stay at home and grow up into driving age and buy cars. And yet, there are, for example, in my case, I live in a duplex with my mother on the other side. My side has 2 cars, my wife and I. My mother doesn't have a car. She's older, she doesn't drive. So we have 1 car per unit. There are all these sort of exceptions for every dire example you can think of where that family or those people or those roommates have a lot of cars. They're the people who have fewer cars. And the thing about actual demand, or even what the parking requirement is trying to achieve, is it's a blended number. And the blended number is typically not as high as most people think about. They think of a worst case scenario, and there are housing units in Southern California where people don't have cars, or 1 car, or 2 cars in a 3-bedroom. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of things at play here when it comes to parking. Housing affordability, it's chicken and egg. The more expensive housing becomes, we do see people doubling up. The idea that we can get more housing built if parking requirements go down also means the idea that people are doubling up less, that they're not all squeezed into a unit with cars parked on the street, taking up space. As housing becomes more affordable in the big picture, there should be less of a parking impact. But as time goes by, fewer spaces, with the lower requirement may get built due to the market, due to need, costs, self-selection. This is a big one, that in a number of places where few parking spaces come with the units, often on busy arterials or busy locations, people who need a lot of parking tend to not rent units that don't have much parking. There are exceptions. There are people who really care about their cars and don't want to leave them on the street every day, squeezing them into spaces, parking, spilling over someplace. So self-selection is a big piece of this, that when you build for fewer parking spaces, when that happens, that the people you attract tend to be people who need fewer spaces. There are exceptions, but I think that's really important to understand. The last bullet on this one, we hear a lot about, people taking Uber and Lyft more, people taking transit more, people biking and walking more. And personally, in some cases that's happening. Certainly those are desirable behaviors, but I would suggest that the reduction in parking requirements is less about changes in behavior than the fact that they were too high to begin with. So if we go back to that last slide, just for a minute, Elizabeth, these numbers, I think, are much more accurate and much lower than a lot of parking requirements. And I think most developers will, at a minimum, build to this. So next slide. Back to the other one. I think that we're sort of getting a right sizing right now as parking requirements are reduced or go away. This is just a nice little photo I took. This is in Culver City, probably, what would you say, 1940s or 50s construction. There's very little parking. Something like this under parking requirements cannot be built. But with reductions, you get this nice missing middle housing that without the parking doesn't have to go very high either. So anyway, I like that picture. Next slide. Okay, so if parking has been overbuilt, and if parking requirements go away, but developers are still building parking, why do we see so many cars parked on the street in some locations? And I would say that's what attracts our attention, is when there are problems. I've seen plenty of those locations. I think they're an exception, but let's talk about that, because spillover, we talk about the need for housing, and yet people say, well, where are people going to park? And when we describe this and make this case, building housing and housing more people and allowing, younger people or older people to move out of, off of people's couches or sharing rooms. And that's, typically that's a little hard to get your head around. That may be a year or 2 years out. And yet the parking problem is something that you encounter right when you come home. So there are concerns about spillover. So here's the bad and the good news. I always say, for the most part, when you build anything, including multifamily housing or single family housing, some cars park on the street. regardless. Now, here's the good news, regardless of how much parking is required. And that is because there's almost always a certain segment of the population that doesn't want to park in the garage or on street. I think about, in my case here, we rented here for many years from an elderly woman who did not want to park in the driveway because she had trouble backing out onto the street. So she would always park on the street. I mean, there are all variations of that. People who don't like to navigate garages, navigate columns. Now we live in this place, we bought the place, and I'm the one who has trouble backing out of the driveway and moving onto the street. Or moving into traffic. So now I park on the street, even if I have an off-street parking space. My point here is that you can require more and more parking. That doesn't necessarily solve the spillover. And what we see when we go around doing research is a fair amount of off-street parking in residential and multifamily developments that's empty because people pull up, maybe it's closer to the unit, maybe it's easy, maybe it's, oh, look, there's a space right on the street. So parking requirements do not solve that problem. And that's a reason that we see spillover regardless. So here's one thing. We've looked at a number of jurisdictions that have eliminated parking requirements, and very often they have some kind of restrictions on the street. Residential parking permits, time restrictions, paid parking. It's much easier to do that and manage the spillover. By do that, I mean reduce parking requirements when you're managing the street. When you're not managing the street, you'll have more spillover. And yet, when you're not managing the street, we still see, typically speaking, a fair number of empty spaces in multifamily parking garages and parking lots. So that's where we're going here with this discussion. Next slide, Elizabeth. So what would help? Here's a parking permit district sign, pretty complicated, but on-street management. I was looking for this presentation of a good picture of Napoleon and a whole thing about parking. Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, meaning if you identify the problem, if you want to do something, tackle that problem. We are trying to tackle the on-street parking congestion with off-street parking requirements, and it doesn't always work very well. So now that we're seeing parking requirements go away, I think we are going to have to see a little more. It doesn't have to be a lot more, but a little more regulation on the street. Statewide, I think it is, there's a 72-hour time limit for parking on the street. Many places don't enforce it or don't enforce it without somebody calling in. Most cities don't really have much in the way of parking enforcement. Some do, many don't, and very often parking enforcement is run by code enforcement, police, people who have other things to do than doing this. But I think the on-street management in cities in Southern California, that's what's going to be needed. And again, it can just be a few cars. The cars maybe for sale, the extra car that many of us have. I inherited one from an elderly family member, and for a long time, there was no disincentive to me leaving it on the street. People do that. Cars sit. Even if people want to reserve a space on the street and leave their driveway open. People who use their garage for foosball, their driveway for basketball courts. Again, in Southern California, our property is very valuable and in short supply. There's a real temptation to park your car on the street with no restrictions or no fee, to leave that space in your garage open for storage, for leisure, recreation, patio furniture, in your driveway. And to put some kind of regulation on the street to say, you can park on the street, but just don't leave your car here forever, and just think twice about it. I think that's where we're going. So I think, what about the parking? We know that when you manage parking, you increase capacity. We are attuned to thinking parking capacity is number of parking spaces. And it's really how you manage those spaces in many respects that gives you the capacity that you need. So parking permits, paid parking, time restrictions, barriers to spillover. We've worked on a number of developments where they restricted or they decided to build fewer spaces. And we looked and we thought, wow, you're on an arterial, it's red curbed, there's not anywhere to cross the neighborhoods. There's no place to spill over. That is a case of self-selection. If you choose to live in one of those units, you get your one space or your two spaces. You don't have any choice. There is nowhere for those cars to go. That's what's going to rein in some of this. Where it's just open, unrestricted parking, that is going to be a concern. And I think, we're looking at the trade-offs providing housing and providing parking. And in those situations, the problem so often we see is the people making the decisions, for developing the property have no control over the street. And the people who have control over the street, there's a disconnect there. Other things, and this is a big one. This is a very interesting one. We were called in a nice community in the Inland Empire, large scale new development that they said this was built with not enough parking. And look, there's spillover. We went in there, we looked, there were plenty of spaces in their nice new garage, in their surface lots, and there was a little spillover. But what was happening was some people had more spaces than they needed. Some people had fewer spaces than they needed. And there was no mechanism by which the people who had too many spaces could share with the people who didn't have enough spaces. So they had a 25%, 30% empty garage and some cars spilling over on the street. Not a lot, but enough to concern some neighbors. The ability, we always think, well, we got to get a handle on the problem of parking. We got to reserve spaces. This is for, this unit, this is for this unit, this is for the retail, and that actually gives us less capacity. We want to share as much as possible because the parking requirement, a number of spaces is rigid, and there will almost always be some people who need more and need less. And in that respect, it can really work pretty well. We see that more often than not. So one of the things we recommended in the case of the LA County Code was, developers should be encouraged, make it a pool of parking so that you can drive in there and you can share. Now, some people maybe for a premium price will want, reserved space, but reserved spaces very often sit empty while others are looking for parking. We want to try to avoid that. Making it easier not to own a car, for sure. Encouraging mixed use, encouraging childcare, grocery, locations. AB 2097 is all about a half mile to transit. When we talked to a number of residents in different communities, they said, yes, we're close to transit, but gosh, the sidewalks are terrible. Sometimes we don't have sidewalks. It's hard to bike. Transit is close by, but most of the time I just need to go to the grocery store. I need to take my kid to school. I do that in the neighborhood. I'm all for using transit. I think we all support transit. I like riding transit, but the walkability and that proximity for really the small trips, I think is really important. For the LA County ordinance, we recommended that points be provided to developers to reduce their parking if they add some daily uses like grocery, like childcare on their property. Things like e-bikes, what we're seeing, and we see this in Orange County, in a number of communities, electric vehicles, it's really exciting, how we're electrifying the system. The quality of the vehicles is really good, but they're big. And well, some of them are big and they're certainly expensive. And yet we see, e-bikes, smaller vehicles that may become more acceptable, roadworthy, to the extent that that can be used for smaller trips. We want to encourage that. And so at the margins, yes, I think there will be a reduction in parking demand for that, but it's all these little things in play that will affect us, that will have an impact when we reduce parking requirements. But at the margin, we're not going to see, I don't think, any dramatic changes for good or for bad. So in conclusion, what about the parking? Will we live differently? I think in a lot of our suburban communities, which much or most of Southern California is, it's going to be some time before we see a lot less parking. I think because, although some people may disagree, parking in a lot of respects has been overbuilt. So I think we're right-sizing a little bit. And I think, for developers, it's really in their interest. They don't want to build too little parking. The response to parking requirements has typically been requirements and building more, but managing a few restrictions here so that people are mindful of how many spaces they use. That's where I think what we're going with this. changing to the built environment will be slow. It will be important. Again, I think we're excited. We want more walkable communities. We want the option to have 2 cars rather than 1. And cars are getting more expensive. And I think that's going to be a factor. But the problem with parking requirements has been more or less how inflexible they've been. So we've gotten the question, if people build parking anyway, what's the big deal about parking requirements going away? They're going to build them anyway, the parking spaces. And the answer is that parking requirements typically have been so rigid that it can make or break a project. It can make or break the feasibility, how long it takes to get approval. So when we spoke with developers, including in LA County, but really, around the state, they said, we want the flexibility, let us decide. Let us decide, maybe, we're building 100 units, but, 5 of them will have 1 parking space or no parking spaces. From those numbers we saw earlier, we know that there are some people, whether they're students coming out of school, people who have aged out of the desire or the ability to drive, or for whatever reason. Some people don't have cars, some people have fewer cars, and the requirement is as it has typically stood, is very inflexible. And this will, at the margins, but I think, really help get more housing built. So I went through that pretty quickly. Pardon me. It looks like an interesting group. I saw somebody from ABM, again, people who manage parking. I think it's going to be more and more about that. Happy to discuss any of this, see if people agree, disagree, or answer your questions.
Yeah, we're not a huge group, so if you want to put your question in the chat, I'm happy to read it out. If you'd like to come off mute and just ask it directly, that's fine too. I want to thank you, Steffen, for doing this. I really wanted to kind of have a forum to address the concern. We're a housing advocacy organization for affordable and workforce housing. And we do hear, questions like, I support more housing, I support affordable housing, but what about the parking? Especially with AB 2011, SB4, which is going to offer the opportunity for religious institutions to build housing, affordable housing on their parking lots. What about the parking? Where am I going to park? And I think as seniors move into a time when there's mobility challenges, I think there's a heightened level of anxiety, particularly among baby boomers who grew up in a time when things were largely auto-oriented, and they are entering a season of their life where there might be mobility challenges. So I think that there's sort of is a heightened level of anxiety, particularly in a community or communities like Orange County that conceive of themselves as very suburban. So I wanted to address that and really have an honest conversation. So I really am grateful to you, Steffen, for leading that conversation and providing the level-headed expertise that, change will come, but like all things in life, change will be incremental and the sky is not falling. So with that, I think we might have one question. So someone says, what is the definition of rich transit or whatever high quality transit area?
Right. What I typically do when I'm working on a project is I just, look at the map, and there is a map provided by SCAG. But I believe high quality, there's a level of service of the quality of the transit, the frequency of the transit. AB 2097, it's interesting. We're working with a couple of cities on the Central Coast. They have occasional Amtrak service, meaning I think trains maybe arrive and depart 3 times a day. Near those stations, AB, to the extent that they're not in the coastal zone, I believe AB 2097 is in effect. So there is a quality of the transit. It has to have a certain frequency, is my understanding. Someone like Manuel Soto on here knows a lot more about that than I do. But typically what I do is I just Google and I say, what is being counted as an HQTA, high quality transit area? Again, they have now and in the future, and I see if the area where I'm working falls under that.
So in our work that we did, especially around SB 827, which did not pass, SB 50, which did not pass, but relied on the designation of high quality transit area for a lot of Orange County, because we have not up until very recently had any fixed rail that was not literal like Metrolink service in our regional rail. It was a 15-minute headway, right? And the headway being the time between buses coming, because in Orange County, most of our transit is rubber tire. So I usually use as a rule of thumb the 15-minute headway. I know that is a factor. The other place where you can look for further definitions, and also where SCAG anticipates high quality transit areas evolving, is to look at the RTP SCS, the Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. That document, I think, is going to become more important this year. I think there's some bill language that's going to lean into the RTP SCS to tie development to high quality transit areas. So if that is of interest to you, I would encourage you to keep your eye on the bills that are coming out. And I think today or tomorrow, I think, is like one of the last days to introduce new bills. So it's definitely interesting times. And SCAG is getting ready to update they do it every 4 years, and SCAG is getting ready to update their RTP SCS. Could Steffen note any additional bills that are coming through the approval process that might also affect parking? Also, where's the best place to go to dig deeper into this issue? So I just rattled off some bills without the number, but yeah.
Let's see.
So the person's looking to know, do you know of any bills that are going to affect parking coming down the current legislative pipeline? And also, what's a good resource to go deeper into this issue?
I do not about this one in particular. I know there, in terms of parking and access and housing production, I do not know. This is a big one, and I think the question will be beyond this half mile. Again, and beyond a half mile, I think developers are going to have even more incentive to build as much parking as they think they need. I talked to, so I am not aware of any more, legislation like this. I think the state and jurisdictions will have to digest this one. And again, there a lot of this I think is not clear. And I'm interested to see, when somebody wants to build in one of these gray areas, geographically or legally, how that's going to be worked out.
Kathy asks, what arguments can we make to overproviding parking in strip malls? I think she might be saying, like, what are arguments to counter, or not to counter, when people say, if we're going to build housing on the parking lot of a strip mall, what is the argument to prove that historically these shopping centers have overprovided the parking?
Well, and in a lot of cases, I wouldn't say in every case, but obviously, but in a lot of cases they have. A couple of things. Typically, we go out there and and I've seen ordinary citizens go out there and count available parking spaces at peak. And when people complain about a lack of parking, typically they're complaining about lack of parking right up front. And yet the pressure is to add more. Well, where would you add more? It would be on the periphery, or it would be going up or going down. And that's where you find empty spaces to begin with, right along the street way out there, or if it's a parking structure, on the top floor or on the bottom floor. So I think that's one of them. I think typically we go out there and we see, is there an abundance? Is there, a surplus of parking? If there is not, here's the thing. Again, if you're talking about, this is not something we've dealt with so much in this case, somebody building housing on an existing commercial site that remains an existing commercial site. Again, that's something we look at shared parking. We say about 40 or 50% of residential cars typically stick around in the middle of the day. If you can share residential spaces, you don't get them all back. Everybody doesn't drive off to work, but you get some of them back. And that's a real efficiency. The hardest thing from a market standpoint is sharing residential parking spaces, because developers are uncomfortable with it, lenders and investors are uncomfortable with it. And very often, residents are uncomfortable with, the idea that people going to a business, is going to be coming and going. I think it's a little different to share with your neighbor. Still not something that everyone likes to do, but that's different than somebody, sharing with a business. So there's a shared parking argument. There's a just going out there and counting argument. And, you know, I do think by and large, parking is dead space, not only from an environmental standpoint, you know, all the asphalt and the runoff, but it doesn't generate, you know, revenue for the city. It's not taxable. We worked on one study for a suburban city in San Diego County, and we revised their parking requirements. They were looking for sales tax revenue, and they found that from the medium to large shopping centers, the parking was so underutilized that all of these shopping centers could put pads and additional businesses in there without impacting the availability of parking for the existing businesses. My experience is shopping center, you know, owners are pretty sensitive about that. They're not going to do something that is going to make their, you know, their existing tenants, you know, squawk or leave.
Unprofitable. Right.
Yeah,
Not
right.
able to lease out their space.
Right. And
Right.
so I think all of that, you know, it's really for the most part, it's a pretty risky thing to go ahead and build something and say, well, there might not be enough parking.
So they're incentivized. I mean, yeah, I have always leaned into, I'm going to trust that the developer who's investing millions and millions of dollars into this, what is really a product, right? That they want to be able to sell and have be viable. You know, they're not going to self-sabotage by, you know, not building, you know, not making a viable product, you know, just out of some, you know, NIMBY idea that, like, you know, I don't know, excuse me, you know, developers are out to stick it to the city, right? That they just build and leave, right? There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of effort that goes into that building. So they want, and eventually they do want to be able to sell it. So I think that this is, you know, going to be a welcome change. And yeah, what you were saying about, you know, what is the shortage? Is it a shortage of parking, or is it a shortage of what I have heard referred to as Doris Day parking, right? Where she just pulls up right to the front door, you know, and there's the canopy to the building that she's going into, right? And yeah, we are going to have a shortage of Doris Day parking, but you know, adding more spaces to the periphery doesn't get you more Doris Day parking.
Right. More Doris Day parking, which I only heard for the first time about last week. So it's funny that you bring it up.
Oh.
That comes through management and policies of making sure that those spaces turn over. Right. And you can build all the parking in the world, and it doesn't get you parking at the front door. Right. So I think that's really, you know, we constantly hear we need more parking. The answer to that is where? And very often it's at the front door. It's not where ultimately you will add it if you know, increase the requirement or something like that. One more thing I think about, you know, with the strip mall argument or the strip mall discussion, and I want to be careful because some cities find this, you know, challenging. Some residents find this challenging. Is that residential parking permits, and there's a whole way of implementing that. You know, if you're really worried about spillover, you know, if you support a housing development or housing, a little tricky because there are regulations on who does and does not get permits. But, you know, in the case of commercial development, there are plenty of places in Southern California that have residential parking permits that say, you know, you can build a high rise, but, you know, we need to contain the spillover. It's not, I think it's more of a political tool than anything, although it does work. You know, it keeps cars from spilling over, but it's again, it's an investment on the part of the city. It takes staff time. It takes an effort, and I understand why they may not be too eager to go there. But look, I mean, we are densifying, and you know, there aren't many dense places in the world that either they manage parking or things get crowded on the street.
Right. We have a question about mechanical stacked parking systems. I'll jump in for a quick second. We have a lot of apartment buildings or complexes, really. They're garden style apartments in my city in North Orange County. And we actually did, when I was on the planning commission, we actually had a property owner come to us and say that they wanted to be able to install mechanical lifts for parking because the complex was built with one space per apartment. And so the city had to go through the process of adopting an ordinance to allow for mechanical lifts. So I can tell you that one city in Orange County has done it, but I'll let you, have you seen that in other cities?
Yes, in fact, I believe Jonathan Wicks, who was on the call, I think worked on a mechanical lift parking ordinance in the city of San Mateo. I mean, once you get into something, mechanical or dare I say complicated like that, yes, it provides more capacity. If you're a resident and you don't go out very often, and maybe you have a nice sports car that you want to store, I think that works. And I don't mean to poo-poo the idea. On the other hand, if you're going in and out, running errands, picking up your kids, and each time you have to get your car onto a mechanical stacker or a lift, guess what starts looking more attractive to you? Parking on the street, right? To go in and out. So I think that there's a role for something like mechanical. I mean, it's like you pay in your time, you pay in your money, you pay in your convenience. Something like mechanical stackers, there is a role for it, but it's, even in terms of cost, we're trying to reduce the cost of building housing for developers so that they build more. If, for example, they feel that they need mechanical parking, there's likely an added cost to that. There's likely added, inconvenience or challenges to residents. It can still work. It can still work well, but it's not a, let's put it, okay, we're putting in mechanical parking, we're good.
Right.
I think it's more, and again, I think some people on this call, like Jonathan, know a lot more about this than I do. In a tight lot where you say, hey, we cannot build here unless we get, squeeze in parking, then it may be worthwhile. But then it does come with additional challenges and costs.
In our case, it was used as retrofit, and the spaces were tied. So you had your space and then you had the mechanical lift above it, and they were tied to the same unit. So I think it's in the ordinance that, the idea being that, that household would manage its own parking, right? So they wouldn't be parking the car that's the one that drops the kids at school necessarily on the top level, if you will.
Right.
Okay, we have one question about, do you have any thoughts on contracting with commercial building owners and using their parking after business hours for residents?
And in fact, I got a question from a colleague about that before this and said, is that what you're going to be talking about? I think if it can work, it's an absolutely great idea. I don't know if anybody here remembers years ago, there was a whole informal but effective program in parts of Long Beach where businesses would close at the end of the day and residents would come in some of the denser areas and businesses would make that parking available. I think typically you want it to be formal. You want an agreement. You want it to be a financial transaction. So you say, hey, business, I'm paying you X number of dollars for this space. And just like any other property transaction, you are providing me an available parking space. I think the biggest challenge with this is, among other things, is first of all, it has to be really proximate. We are working in one city in Orange County where we saw some really busy parking areas on the street, and at the adjacent arterial there was empty commercial parking, and I think that's an exciting opportunity. But again, people walking back and forth to their cars, if there's not that expectation, even in an urban-ish environment, I think it's a great idea if you have the proximity. I think commercial property owners should be interested, but you can't just ask them to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. But it's worth the money. Whether a city involves itself in a program, whether they just facilitate it through relaxation of regulations, or whether it's just an agreement entirely between a resident and a mini mall. I think that's there are different questions about that, but if you can do it, yeah, it should be done. A lot of those, when we do a study in any area, so much of the availability is empty off-street parking. But like I said, because reserved parking spaces sit empty a lot of the time.
So there's a note that it works in Long Beach, and that churches in downtown Alamitos Beach, I'm not familiar with that community, but
in downtown and Alamitos Beach. Okay.
Oh, yeah, and out, yeah.
That's
Where
fantastic.
is Alamitos Beach?
Alamitos Beach, well, I believe it's closer to, there's Alamitos Bay, but Alamitos Beach is right up adjacent on the water, adjacent downtown Long Beach, I believe.
Oh, okay. Well, it's not in Orange County, so I can be forgiven for not knowing where it is. All right, do we have any thoughts or final questions? We're just shy of 1 o'clock, so want to respect everyone's time, but
I saw, was it Manuel? Did he have something here? About 3 questions up?
although, oh, so he was commenting on what we were talking about with the Doris Day parking. He says, although if the answer is more parking at the front door, what they are stating is the need to manage parking at the front door so that you can increase utilization and access of a scarce resource.
Yes.
So the Doris Day front door parking, maybe it's 15 or 30-minute parking, not 2-hour parking.
Mm-hmm. And we see with residential, I said, I'm a little skeptical of the extent to which people are relying on Uber and Lyft, especially with over COVID, the way the service moved. But residents who really do want front door parking, I know where I live, it's a residential area, a lot of duplexes, triplexes, but I see some people on certain days taking Uber and Lyft because they want front door to wherever they're going, front door. So it's, yeah, I think I think we need to be mindful of that, desire for convenience. And that's a different thing than just make them build more parking, Like I said, in some cases, unfortunately, there are going to be some parking impacts anyway. If we want to manage, if the issue is the street, manage the street. Don't worry so much about building more and more because it may not help. In fact, we always say, in so many instances, you can build more, but if you don't also manage what you have, the additional parking that you build will not be used, and it's all for naught.
Right. There's Lisandro sent me a message that he has a question that he'd like to ask. Lisandro, go ahead and come off mute and ask your question.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the presentation. Very, very insightful. My question is more of policy implementation. So you've probably worked on tons of studies and have been consultants for cities and private developers. How have you seen other cities or maybe developers educate their planning commission or their city council on these things like parking reductions and how less parking is not necessarily going to be a negative impact? How have you seen that done? Like through a workshop, or what have you seen? Just kind of a general question there.
Yes, and again, I would say AB 2097 really changed the landscape in that we've been now in front of a few cities where the decision is kind of made for them. That said, I think that I think workshops, I think one-on-one conversations, just the more communication, and really getting your ducks in a line before you go up to vote on approvals. I think that's what you're asking in terms of how this happens. Getting your allies together, looking at, so often, we look at city documents or even, housing elements and say, look, we do need to build this. The question is, how are we going to implement? What can we do to mitigate impacts? I feel like your question is 2-part. One is how, and I think it's just been the communication, don't spring things on people too quickly. If you're going into, a vote, ideally you really want to know, where everybody's standing before that. At the same time, what kind of conversations? I think it's setting priorities. And I think, with the state forcing some hands, it's also saying, well, here's where we are. What do we do to, I don't want to sound negative, but to make the best of it, and that this can be managed. For the most part, the sky doesn't fall. At the same time, where there are impacts, this can be dealt with. It's a little bit of a vague answer, but
No, but I think
we talk to anybody offline on this.
I think having been a planning commissioner and a transportation commissioner in my own city, I think, well advertised study sessions so that people can, the city has, city staff have a real comeback when they can say, when the person comes up and says, I didn't know anything about this, right? Well, it was in the newspaper, it was on the website for, several weeks, we advertised it. I mean, you're never going to please everyone, but, doing, as robust of an effort to get the word out, I think is, the best course of action. But yeah. So, all right, well, we are like right at 1, like 3 minutes of 1, but I really thank you, Steffen, for doing this for us. I'm really grateful that we got to have this conversation. It attracted a mixed crowd of our normal, I would say our typical housing advocates, but definitely some professionals in the room that I haven't necessarily met before. So I'll just plug us really quickly. We are People for Housing Orange County. We're the YIMBY organization, Yes in My Backyard. And we will throw our donation link in the chat. If you have found this valuable and would like to support our work, that's where you can find us. My email is elizabeth@peopleforhousing.org. It's FOR, not the number. So yeah, would love to hear from any of you if this has been helpful. And again, Steffen, really grateful to you for having done this, and great discussion, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Really appreciate it. Happy to discuss because it's a complicated issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.